Hello, everyone. Sorry to be so late getting back to you. Still testing positive, but we're going to go ahead and share a few thoughts on Ecclesiastes chapter 6 as soon as I start sharing the screen. Okay, so as we're preparing to teach Ecclesiastes 6, just looking at the chapter numbers, you would assume that chapter 6 marks the halfway point of the book. And indeed it does. You'd think it'd be at the end of chapter 6 since there's 12 chapters. But actually, if you count verses like the Masoretes, did, the section of the Masoretes known as the Sopharim, to Sopher means to count. And so they were the ones who counted not only all the letters in the Hebrew Bible, but all the different spellings in the Hebrew Bible and all the different ways that they were used. So they identified chapter 6, verse 10 as being the center of the book by counting the verses. And of course, if you look at the English verses, it'll depend on how you handle those last few verses that we call the epilogue, which seem to have been added on at a later date. So what this allows is for 8 sections that occur before chapter 6, verse 9. And each of these 8 sections ends with either emptiness of emptiness, vapor of vapor, breath of breath, or with chasing the wind. And that means that there are 8 sections after it from 6:10 to the epilogue, with 4 endings that end with the verb to find, and 4 that end with the verb to know. So those are divisions that are identified by means of looking very, very carefully at the text itself. And I find that very interesting that we have that kind of symmetry in this book. Now, it also allows us to group the two halves of the book in 2 different ways that I find helpful. One of them is the first half being under the rubric of the focusing question: what is the advantage in unfulfilling labor? Or what's the point of work that's just drudgery? Now, amazingly enough, in this morning's Chicago Tribune, there was this cartoon where the doctor and his wife are having a discussion. The wife has just been laid off, and the doctor is talking about his frustrations and the fear of being laid off. He says, "That's the way it goes, Elle. There are huge budget restraints at the hospital. Everyone's afraid that the next cutback will include them. You wouldn't believe the bickering that goes on. It's the tension. Sometimes it really gets to you. Every day I come home tired and crabby. And what for? Why don't we all just quit this rat race, move to some desert island and become hermits? Why don't we start enjoying life?" And she says, "There's no money in it." This is the hand to mouth. I have to work to exist to survive that Qohelet is questioning. Is that really what work is all about? Qohelet sees the downside of toil, of drudgery. But remember, at the end of chapter 5, at the end of our last session, Qohelet told us to enjoy the simple gifts, including meaningful work that God has given us. Now, it also allows in the second half the question to be what we're going to end kind of with tonight is, who knows what is good? And if you know anything about rhetorical questions in the Bible, you know the answer is usually negative. Who knows what is good? Nobody human, that's for sure. So, similarly, one could divide the book into two parts. And I really like this. Dr. Sal said that the first half would be seen as a reflection on everything being elusive, and the second half being about the ethics or the how to of risk or life management. So, the first couple of chapters, as humans, we can't rely on anything. But ultimately, in chapter 3, things are in God's control. We just don't know what all he plans. And relative good and goodness is not good enough, as in chapter 4. So then, what do we do about it? Well, first off, we demonstrate proper reverence toward God. Remember, watch your steps from last session. We demonstrate proper reverence toward God in both worship and in our daily life. And then we focus on enjoyment compared to acquisition, which gives us stuff that we could lose, or consumption, which means we may not be able to keep going because we've used up all we have learned. So the first half, that's kind of, where we're getting to the conclusion of. And then the second half is seen as a reflection response on the idea, first of all, that everything is uncertain. And then what do we do about uncertainty? So I'll give you a preview of that. And we're starting the section tonight. Humans can't be certain about what's good. And then we'll find that righteousness and wisdom are complicated. It's complicated. It's not easy to explain and not easy to suss out. And then the world is experienced as arbitrary. What are you going to do about that? First off, don't be afraid to live life. And apparently, I've become an internet fiend because I've shortened live life to life. Don't be afraid to life. Uh, and then recognize that the world involves authentic risk. Don't minimize the risk, don't maximize the risk. Be aware of the risk and live accordingly. Learn to live with risks. And finally, figure out what it is to live with your creator and to respect your creator and to find out what impact your creator is going to have on your life. So this is the idea of how to get a handle on the world. And so that is a really good way of looking at Ecclesiastes. And that's why tonight, when we're at a transition chapter, is a good way to reconsider, what we're looking at. So for our purposes, we should take this give and take, this back and forth between observation and reflection and directions and guidelines in dealing with the problems, so that if we're currently dealing with, by the end of tonight's session, the idea of uncertainty, we realize it's relevant because it's a very real issue today. Because both philosophers and scientists are dealing with the implications of relativity on both truth and reality. And our whole socio-political world is dealing with those who find alternative facts to be acceptable. In fact, since our last session, the Chicago Tribune published two comic strips related to this, where the little girl protagonist is dealing with her coyote friend and verbal antagonist. And the coyote says, and if you knew the cartoon strip, you would know that these characters are being warped and changed as they go from frame to frame, because the coyote says reality is elastic, and she says no, it's fixed. He says our perception of time and space may be fixed, but time and space are elastic. And she asks if he's quoting Einstein, and he says it's all relative, and you can see how warped and mushed out of shape they are. When the follow-up strip went like this, she said, I don't want to live in a world where facts are fluid and reality is subjective. I want a world that has a fixed point to guide us. And he says, man, are you in the wrong universe? And she's not happy about it. But in reality, that's what Qohelet keeps saying. He keeps saying, things are changing. They're not static. And so he wants to find out, what's the point? What's the use? What's the advantage? What's the edge? What's the profit? And in many cases, he's saying there is no edge, but life is a gift from God and we need to enjoy it. Now, before we jump into the passage for tonight, I want to share with you some of the rabbit hole that I descended as I was preparing these notes, because I knew that the word that's often translated as vanity or emptiness was important, hovel, and it's the same as the name for Abel in Genesis chapter 4, but it means wisp, breath, vapor, emptiness. And as we've seen in Ecclesiastes, it can mean absurdity or things being topsy-turvy, upside down. So I knew that in one source it said that it was found 37 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. Of course, I had to count that for myself, and all of them are listed on the right side of your slide. But my count was 38 times, and it could even be 39 if you accepted the emendation that are found in some manuscripts, but I don't. And then I noticed how often I was running across the word tov, the root, that can mean goodness or better or positive, healthy, and the like. And I decided to count the number of times that appeared, and I found out that it appeared 52 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. Since I looked at good, I decided I better look at evil. And this took quite a while because evil is, spelled as both raw and ra in two different ways that you see there. It means evil, foul, foulness. It can even mean sickness or a burden. But in this case, it's mostly evil. And I counted 31 times, and to my delight, found that agreed with Miller in his book on symbol in Ecclesiastes of 31 times. But, I also, thought that the word choshek, the absence of light, darkness, as it were, seemed to be important in our passage tonight. And so I counted it, found it appears 8 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. And when I was looking at Ra, bad, I also found the word for illness, chala, and chala may sound familiar to you because one of the sons that Ruth and her sister-in-law Oprah were married to uh, was named Kilion, and his name comes from Chala, which means illness. So basically, his name meant he's sick and gradually getting worse. So he must have been a sickly baby even when he was born, but he lived long enough to marry, and that's where the Ruth story comes from. But anyway, I found that was only 4 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. But anyway, I'm going to upload an Excel document of this in case you want to translate any of it to Chinese and look at it, because the idea of evil is right at the beginning of our passage tonight, as is the idea of sick or ill. And then this vapor or emptiness is, of course, all the way through it, as it is all the way through the book. And Tov shows up a couple of times at the beginning and at the end. But this idea of darkness is right there early on. So what you see is that our passage is front loaded with words that are negative and ugly, and that it's toward the end that we can expect to find at least some relief. We're not going to find a lot of relief in this chapter, but that's the way that it goes. So anyway, when the last chapter was concluded, we heard Qohelet offer some sound advice. Take the simple things as gifts from God and enjoy them. And this was specifically in contrast to the hoarder who seemed to have tried to hang on to everything until misfortune struck, and then he didn't have anything at all to leave his heir. So that was a sad thing. But the counterpart of that is enjoy things as God gives them to you. Don't try to have so much more, but try to hang on to what God gives to you. Well, now chapter 6 opens with another case study, another story. And this time, the person doesn't physically lose everything through misfortune or bad investments. Instead, he has everything, but he can't really enjoy them. Now, it clearly seems like the arbitrary reversal of Qohelet's advice. At the end of the last chapter, he says, enjoy the simple things. And here's a guy who can't enjoy them. And for this session, I'm going to consistently give you Robert Alter's very literary translation of Ecclesiastes 6, starting with these 2 verses. There is an evil that I have seen under the sun, and it's heavy on humankind. A man whom God gives wealth and possessions and honor, and he lacks nothing for himself of all he desires. And God does not grant him to enjoy it, for a stranger will enjoy it. Now, these verses contain something that Qohelet believes to be absolutely wrong. So he uses that very strong word evil right up front. And interestingly, a lot of interpreters believe that Qohelet is actually blaming God for that evil on the basis of the phrase, God does not grant him to enjoy it. I see it in numerous commentaries. William P. Brown's interpretation commentary, James Crenshaw's Old Testament Library commentary, Tremper Longman's New International Commentary on the Old Testament on Ecclesiastes. And they may be right in that Qohelet may be trying to challenge God like Job did, but I actually disagree. I think these interpreters are making too much of that God does not grant him to enjoy it line. Remember, God has provided this in the first place. God gives wealth and possessions and honor. And I'm also troubled by some differences between the last part of chapter 5 and here that can best be explained through Hebrew grammar. Uh, First off, this may be an exception because this case study is talking about a man to whom God gives wealth and possessions and honors, as opposed to chapter 5, verse 19, that was talking about every man or every person who ought to enjoy the simple gifts of life that God has given. So I wonder if we don't already have an exception here. We're talking about someone who hasn't enjoyed life, and perhaps, as I'm going to argue, it may be his choice. Secondly, is this definitive? Does this have to be the way things are? It's a lot like in A Christmas Carol when Scrooge is dealing with the ghost of Christmas future, and he says, "Is this, O Spirit, the way things must be or might be? Can they be changed? Is there a free will there?" And I think we have a hint in the tense, because in this chapter, our chapter for tonight, we have the present tense. God gives wealth and possessions and honor, rather than God gave, perfect tense, in 5:19. Now, the perfect tense was the prophetic tense, the prophetic perfect. The prophets used to love it to talk about the future, but they would talk about it with the perfect tense as though it's already done. Because if God said it, it's already done, according to the prophets. That's pretty interesting. And the imperfect tense, the God gives here, is incomplete. It's open-ended. And at least to me, it suggests that the human response to God's action of giving here is not predetermined. Now, that may be counter to what Qohelet believes at times. Qohelet isn't always consistent with that, but I think that his use of the tense here, the imperfect tense, actually leaves the possibility open that the human could react properly. In fact, I think that this thing is about attitude. Because what we have here is an emphasis on emptiness as we get further, uh, emptiness versus God's gift. We really need to pay attention to that. So I would suggest that this hinges a lot on the wealthy person's attitude. And I may have told you previously about my college roommate's father. He worked as a caretaker of the grounds for a mansion in Ojai Valley, California. Now, this garden was so lush that it was used as the setting for Shangri-La in a Hollywood film. And this multimillionaire, he was one of the early founders of 3M Corporation. In one sense, he was the mining in Minnesota mining and manufacturing. But he was so stingy that he wanted his swimming pool to look nice. But since he wasn't swimming in it and he didn't want to invite anybody in to swim in it, he used a cyanide-based preservative instead of chlorine to keep the water pure. And what that meant was that no one, including him, could use the pool except for the one time per year when he would have the pool drain. They would wash out the inside of the pool to get rid of any of the cyanide-based chemicals They would refill it and chlorinate it in order for the pool party to happen. Now, the reason I'm aware of this is because my roommate told me about all of the library resources that were available to him when he visited his folks. The estate had a self-standing library building, and my roommate told me that he had it all to himself. I asked him, didn't the owner ever use it? Nope. It was built for his ex-wife. And when she left him, she took all the books away. And after she left, he wanted to have an event in the library. And rather than have all of those empty shelves, he purchased an entire used bookstore and he filled up the shelves that way. So it had reference books, atlases, antique books, first editions, you name it. And when I went up to stay with my friend for a weekend, we had them all to ourselves. We were strangers who got to use all of these books that he purchased, but because of his attitude, he was unable to enjoy. When President Eisenhower used to visit the estate, he had a one-hole golf course built for the president. But by the time we were visiting, he had had my friend's father take it out. And at one point, there was a private bowling alley in the basement of the main house, but when we visited, it had rotted and it was now unusable when we explored it. Just for fun, I rolled a bowling ball down the alley and it actually fell into a hole. Well, you see, I can't help but think about this wealthy, stingy man whenever I read these verses of Ecclesiastes. Because I don't think God forced him not to enjoy his wealth. I think he was afraid to enjoy it. Even my old seminary professor was writing about this passage and expressed it that the man lacked capacity to enjoy his wealth. And others speculate that since Qohelet gives no specific reason, perhaps it was ill health, a stroke, insanity, depressive illness, chronic crippling pain, some condition in which you have to look on impotently as other people enjoy all you labored for. You can't enjoy it yourself. Well, that speculation's certainly possible, but there's also another element here, this idea of the stranger consuming his wealth. The only people who can enjoy his wealth are people outside his family who, by some legal process, receive his wealth. There's a saying in English, use it or lose it. In many ways, that's something like Jesus's parable of the talents. Remember the one talent person who was afraid to lose it? This individual didn't value what he had enough to use it, so it ended up going to someone else, like that talent did in Jesus's parable. Now, the loss of property from those who didn't build it was always a possibility in the ancient world. Military conquerors could take it. Squatters could live on the land that you weren't using and then claim it when you died. And tax collectors could come after you in the name of your own or foreign kings. Bandits could steal the property that could be carried away. Indeed, stranger could be even more literal, because during this period, Palestine was filled with both indigent and immigrant populations, both the people of the land and the returning exiles. It was a time when land and family were issues of great contention. And consequently, one family's roots played a decisive role in reclaiming land that was once lost in exile, which is not unlike the situation in Palestine today. Well, as powerful as that observation I just read was, James Crenshaw reminds us the word that's used for stranger here, nepos, is not the usual term for foreigner, ger. So we can't be too certain exactly what Qohelet meant. What we do know for sure is that this wealthy fellow did not follow the admonition given by Qohelet at the end of chapter 5, and that it cost him. In fact, it cost him so much that the next verses will get darker. Now, before we go to the next verses, some people notice that God praised Solomon in 2 Chronicles 1:11 because he didn't ask for wealth, possessions, or honor. Notice what this man got: wealth, possessions, and honor. So it might be that either Qohelet has Solomon in mind as the case study, and in that case, Jeroboam taking the 10 tribes away from his son Rehoboam, would reflect the stranger taking away what he'd built up. Or he may be drawing upon Solomon's request for wisdom instead of wealth, possessions, and honor, as implying that the person in the case study was not acting with wisdom. And if that second interpretation is true, that would be additional support for my position that it was this wealthy man's attitude that cost him, and therefore God held back from him. But let's go to the darker part. Does verse 3 reflect the same or another person? If a man begot 100 children and lived many years, and many were the days of his life, he might yet not be sated with good things, and even a burial he might not have. I said, better than he is the stillborn. For in mere breath did it come, and into darkness it goes, and in darkness its name is covered. The very sun it did not see or know. More ease for it than for him. And were he to live 1,000 years twice over, yet good things he did not enjoy. Does not everything go to a single place? Now, children were considered a blessing in the ancient world, largely because they increased the workforce that was available for the family's efforts. So they increased the family's income and wealth. It was much the same in the rural USA when agricultural was predominantly based on the family farm. But what Qohelet wants his readers or hearers to know is that offspring are no guarantee of wealth. It reminds me of one disgruntled mother of troubled teens who complained that raising children was like tending a bucket of snakes. But you need to understand that what Qohelet is doing is offering a counterexample to the usual biblical wisdom. For example, Psalm 127, verses 3 through 5 says, behold, children are a gift of the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. They will not be ashamed when they speak with their enemies in the gate. The idea of a quiver full of sons is a blessing. In this case, what appears in the case study in our passage is that it appears that the offspring didn't even care enough about their father to provide for his burial. An improper burial was a great disgrace in the ancient world, such that if this person couldn't even count on that, then Qohelet was saying the individual's life was meaningless. In fact, one could argue that the person who was not honored in their grave and the stillborn who died before being named here were in the same situation. Neither might as well not have existed, and both end up in the same place. In fact, it's kind of interesting that Psalm 58:8 ends with a curse that reads, like a stillborn child, may they not see the sun. And that dovetails with the way 6:4 reads in the Hebrew. Our familiar word for vapor, wisp, emptiness, breath begins with its soft H sound, havel, and then the word for darkness with its harsh H sound comes in the next two phrases. So whether vapor, a wisp, or emptiness, it's tantamount to darkness. Now, I want to read that verse 6:4 to you because I want you to hear how Qohelet weaves the sound together. Ki bahevel ba wu v'choshek yeleth wu v'choshek shema yaskva. You get it? There it is. From emptiness to darkness. Both essentially go to the same place. Both are essentially dishonored in the same way. In fact, it appears what this verse is saying is that the person who has their identity stripped away in the fashion of the unburied man in the case study is even worse off than the stillborn, because he's seen what was possible and didn't get it. And that may be worse than the stillborn who never had the chance to see the possibility. In that sense, Qohelet is saying the stillborn child is better off. Now, conventional biblical wisdom was that it was a blessing to live to a good old age. But in verse 6, Qohelet takes issue with that. Now, before we get to verse 6, let me remind you about verse 4. I got so excited about reading it in Hebrew, I forgot to say this word vapor may refer to something like the Leviticus Rabbah 29:8, where the babies are vapor in the wombs of their mothers. And what we have is a tombstone for a stillborn baby. It died on the same day of its birth. Now, in our culture, with people going to that trouble, they probably named that baby. But in the Hebrew culture, you wouldn't have given it its name until that eighth day when the circumcision came, and it was the actual appropriate naming day. So you needed to have it there. So there's no real identity, but babies are vapor in the wombs of their mother ties that together. And like I said, Hevel and Choshek start with the soft H and the hard H respectively, so that you could hear it that way. Vapor and darkness are similar in that they obscure, they deny one's identity. So, who was the oldest person in the Bible? And I know that if you guys were actually here instead of watching this on video, that you would know it was Methuselah, that he died at 969 years old. So, if a person lived 2,000 years, like in chapter 6, verse 6 of Ecclesiastes, that person would be more than twice as old as the person who lived the longest ever. But the person would still be cursed if he couldn't enjoy his prosperity. Now, I think this adds support to the argument that it isn't that God willfully withheld enjoyment from the person, but that God honored the person's decision to be so greedy or so paranoid that they couldn't enjoy it. But regardless, Qohelet tells us that the subject of the case study, the stillborn, indeed, everyone goes to the same place, the underworld, the grave, death. He reminds us that we all die. You see the Latin at the bottom of the slide, memento mori. And that's significant because it's the Roman tradition of a slave riding behind the conquering general in a triumphal victory procession. And while the masses are shouting out how great the general was, the slave was required to whisper memento mori in his ear, which is Latin for remember, you will die. It's actually a good thing to remember our mortality. We shouldn't obsess about it, but we should pay attention to the fact that we have a limited amount of time to invest, as Qohelet would say, under the sun. Let's go on. All a man's toil is for his own mouth, yet his appetite will not be filled. For what advantage has the wise over the fool? What good is it for the poor man to know how to get round among the living? Better what the eyes see than desire going round. This too is mere breath and hurting the wind. Again, we've read from Robert Alter's translation, and I wonder if you've ever heard the term hand-to-mouth existence. It means a person who works just to survive and never gets ahead. But whether you're hand-to-mouth or you're slightly ahead of the curve, it's always human nature not to be satisfied. Now, I really appreciate the following paragraph that refers back to earlier Ecclesiastes and also to some in Proverbs. Although all labor is for the mouth, the gullet, like the sea, never fills up. Chapter 1, verse 7. Or like the eyes, it is never satisfied. Chapter 1, verse 8, chapter 4, verse 8. Indeed, the appetite can be compared to death itself, which is indiscriminate and insatiable. Proverbs 27:20 and 30:15-16. The result, or the gain of work, thus, cannot be the foundation for happiness, the sage contends, for it does not satisfy any more than hoarding possessions or cultivating fleeting flame can. That's from Brown's Ecclesiastes commentary. Now, verse 8, of course, is very cynical. Remembering that rhetorical questions usually expect a negative answer, we would expect that the wise don't have any advantages over fools, and neither does the poor man who is good at ingratiating himself with others. And then verse 9 is a return to Qohelet's idea of enjoying what you have. In this case, one should enjoy what one sees rather than to chase after what one dreams about. Always dreaming about more is a source of dissatisfaction. Of course, since the Hebrew word for going here, translated going round in Alter's translation to avoid it, but in some translations just going, as in dying, could be the possible translation. And Qohelet could also simply mean it's better to be alive than to be dead. But I think really what we have here is that it's, better to be satisfied with what you see than to always be rushing to try to fill your life up with something else. Always be rushing on, because that rushing on is a mere wisp, mere emptiness, mere breath, and shepherding the wind. Well, that's pretty negative. And that kind of closes the first half of the book. And it's negative unless we realize it's that idea of enjoying the simple things in life as a gift from God that makes the difference. That's the counsel. That's the only wisdom that Qohelet really believes that he has, even though he's still striving for it and observing, seeking it. At the same time, he recognizes it all essentially comes down to God's gifts. As for the last three verses, which are rather transitional, it goes, what was has already been called by name and is known. As he is man and cannot deal with one more powerful than he. For there are many words that increase mere breath. What is the advantage for man? For who knows what is good for man in life, in his days of mere breath, for he spends them like a shadow. Who can tell man what will be after him under the sun? Now, you notice the clay head being molded here. To make his final observation chapter, Qohelet draws from Genesis chapter 2 and God's instructions to Adam to name the creatures of creation. Indeed, the very word for humankind, or man, as Alter translates it here, is Adam. So 4 times in these verses, you could translate it as he is Adam. What is the advantage for Adam? What is good for Adam in life? And who can tell Adam what will be after him under the sun? Now, I'm not saying that Qohelet is really meaning Adam as the individual character in Genesis 2, but I am saying that he's talking about humankind as being like Adam. Adam was allowed to name the creatures. But when it became Adam's sinful will versus God's holy will, who was the one who got kicked out of the Garden of Eden? Who was the one that was kicked away from the tree of life? Now, Qohelet, like many philosophers, knows that naming is important. Just as in medicine, diagnosis is a key to a good prognosis, in many cases, naming a problem or an opportunity is the key to solving it or making it yours. And especially in our modern age, we can name and identify and control and modify so many things. But in the end, we cannot fully understand God, and we certainly can't contend with him, our sinful will versus his holy will. And so we have this image of a man who cannot deal with one more powerful than he, but this is really all of humankind. And more specifically, it is us. We cannot deal with one more powerful than ourselves unless we learn to submit to his will. Now, Qohelet is also worried that just talking can easily lead to babble and frustration. Now, Robert Alter, after translating this, had an observation about this passage. He said, Qohelet is a wisdom writer who constantly questions the value of wisdom. He knows that a human life is likely to be bleak, that it is intrinsically unpredictable, that it may end badly and surely be blotted out by death. So his wisdom is to register this perception. But apart from his occasional exhortations to enjoy, he does not presume to know what's good for man, unlike the purveyors of mainline wisdom. There's a certain humility in recognizing that for all the possibilities that God has granted us, we cannot know the whole inside and outside of every situation. And if we knew what was best for us all the time, then we wouldn't need to seek God, would we? So words lose their efficacy, they lose their strength before the one who is stronger, who is God. Yet there are lots of humans who babble on ad nauseum, hopelessly thinking that something will change if they just keep talking, or that God will be more favorably inclined to their desires as a result. Now, I love this verse 11 because Qohelet artfully mixes together the same sounds. Debarim harba marbim habel. Debarim harba marbim habel. And you hear all of those sounds coming together, seeming like a crowd. Well, Dr. Sau thinks that he was trying to imitate Babel. And so he paraphrases verse 11 as wordiness is not worthiness, a clever way of showing what was happening in the Hebrew at the time. But Qohelet says, who knows what's good for man? And the answer to a rhetorical question, usually nobody. Nobody human knows. Who knows what's good for humanity? Because in humanity's days of mere breath, he spends them like a shadow, no solidity. Who can tell man what will be after him under the sun? Who can tell you what your legacy is going to be? No human can. So one thing is for sure. Qohelet isn't content to offer us pre-cooked answers. He has faith in God, but he's not about to presume that he understands everything about God and what God wants. I pray that we will have more Christians who think like him today. For God needs the humble who admit what we don't know more than God needs the proud who insist upon what they are sure of, but may not be true. Let's pray. Precious Holy Father, thank you for this passage. Thank you for the fact that it keeps us humble and warns us that we need to savor each moment, each day, each gift from you. In Jesus' holy name, amen.